drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Healy, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's good to be here, Nick. Thanks for asking me.
And can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself? Where are you calling in from, and what's your background?
Okay, my background is that I've worked as a doctor for several decades at this point. And before I began that, I did some research on the serotonin system on which the SSRI group of drugs work. And that was very fortuitous in the sense that I was working on it before these drugs came on stream. And that meant that a range of people like the companies that made SSRI drugs, that's the selective serotonin reuptake inhibiting drugs used to treat people who are depressed or anxious. They figured I'd be a good person to educate other doctors and to the wider public on this group of drugs. Okay, so it meant I got to see what happened at the lab with these drugs. It meant that I had links to most of the major pharmaceutical companies making these drugs who it's a bit wrong to put it like this, who thought I was one of them, and they talked reasonably openly and freely with me. I also got to see what happened when I gave the drugs to people, which isn't what the pharmaceutical companies were actually telling people was going to happen.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, that's the background that's led to me being in this area. And over the course of the last 40 years or so, I've worked in Ireland and the UK and Canada. And I've been in the United States a lot, giving talks at various different universities and meetings, etc.
Yeah. And to be sure, we're going to talk a lot about, SSRIs, pharmaceutical drugs, psychoactive drugs, brain stuff, psychiatry stuff, the things that probably most listeners are expecting. But also, you're somewhat of a historian, and the place I want to start is actually sort of with the history of medicine and the history of Western civilization in general. And the place I want to start is with the story, or what you might call the myth that I once believed, which many people I think still believe, and that I was more or less taught, at least in indirect way in my education, which is what I'll just call one of the cartoon stories of Western civilization, which goes something like this. We had the religious dark ages where we were ruled by priests and the church, and then we got enlightened. And after the Enlightenment, we developed modern science and secular institutions, and then modern secular technological progress took over, gradually ridding us of superstition, religious rituals, and incantations, and so forth. And so today we have, in medical practice and government policy, these things are determined in a secular, evidence-based, and scientific fashion. What's your basic critique of that version of Western history?
Yeah, now that's an enormous question to ask up front and to kick us off. And I think there's a few flaws in it. One of the flaws is the religious approach towards things. When you hear that word, you think about people being holy, as it were. You think of them praying to God. You think of them on their knees and things like this. And that is one aspect to it, the mystic or the hermit or whatever who goes off and just thinks about the things that count, the other world. But in fact, one of the main functions of the religious enterprise is to keep the herd together.
Hmm.
And in that sense, it's very tribal.
Yes.
And in a sense, it also gave rise to the nation state, which is also all about keeping the herd together.
Right.
Uh, and that works very well for ensuring that we've got the World Cup in football and the Olympic Games. We need herds to compete at these things, and they can be fun. But keeping the herd together actually extends these days into science. Now, maybe not so much physics, but certainly medicine and certainly mental health medicine, where people are particularly tribal. You got people who say, well, we need to handle mental health problems by taking a psychotherapeutic approach. Or you get other people saying, well, we need to use drugs to treat the problems. And you get a situation where the two tribes can barely talk to each other. And this is rather like the political situation in the United States at the moment, which has become much more tribal than it ever was before. So the idea that we've been moving from a dark ages to an enlightened period of time is all wrong, I think. We seem to be as tribal as we ever were. And the job remains one of how to be enlightened, how to proceed in a way that's going to help others rather than have us all
Hmm.
confined to our particular
Hmm.
boxes. And the SSRI story reveals how badly wrong a tribal approach can
Yeah.
be, and it also reveals what the alternative might be.
Hmm. One of the one of the possible analogies I want to explore here is when you look at the history of, say, Christianity in the West. In highly simplified terms, you had the Catholic Church, who was sort of running things for a very long time, and then we have the Protestant Reformation, and a big component of this involved the technological innovation of the printing press, which allowed the Bible to be printed and literacy rates to eventually go up, and people could read the Bible themselves instead of having to take a priest's word for it. In other words, the Bible was sort of made open access and it was sort of hidden before. And we had to rely on the priest class to tell us what was in it and basically take their word for it. It was, knowledge came by fiat. And so the Protestant Reformation was very powerful because it had this sort of decentralizing, democratizing effect on access to information in that case in the Bible, and it had huge social consequences. Today, I wonder if there's an analogy we can draw with the whole sort of scientific enterprise where we still sort of rely on a class of what we call experts to tell us what is in the sort of esoteric literature that the average person can't really discern. And right now, we do seem to be in a what you might analogize to a printing press democratization era of information, in that a lot of the information that used to be hidden is now percolating throughout society. People have access to it via the internet and other things. Is there a legitimate analogy to draw here? Is there an analogy to draw between sort of the literal priest caste or class of the pre-Enlightenment era and the so-called expert class of today, and that we often have to rely on them to simply tell us what they say the literature says?
Yeah, now that's a great question and a great point to make. And I think there's a degree of truth to it, but also there's a degree of nuance that we need, which is the internet comes on stream, I guess somewhere in the late 80s, early 90s or
Mm-hmm.
thereabouts. And by the end of the 1990s, it's looking like it's going to be a great democratizing force.
Mm-hmm.
And it's particularly appreciated by people who are on the SSRI group of drugs and are having problems from them. People are actually becoming suicidal. People who are getting hooked to drugs and finding it very hard to get off them. And when they go to their doctor, to the priestly caste, they're told, no, 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 these things can't happen. We've got evidence-based medicine, which is, the Bible. It's the articles that appear in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is as close to the Bible as you can get these days. And they're claiming that these drugs don't cause that problem, that, the drugs only work, they don't have serious problems, or if they do have problems, they're awfully rare. But in actual fact, they're extremely common. And the the internet appeared to be opening things up, and a bit like, as you said, the printing press, it
Mhm.
was putting people in the kind of position where they could read things, they could find other people were having the same kind of experiences, the same kind of problems, other people were being gaslit the way they were too,
Yeah.
and it looked like it was going to make a huge difference. So this was around 2004, 2005. It really looked like the internet was changing things for the better. But what became clear around that time as well was industry realized this,
Yes.
and industry realized that the internet was a great way to sell drugs, and they needed to colonize the internet. And the internet, to a large extent, is completely run by industry these days.
Hmm.
Yes, you can find groups that where people who are having problems on drugs meet and talk about the problems. But you also hear that on maybe Facebook groups for people who are on this antidepressant or that antidepressant, if they start talking about the antidepressant causing them to actually become suicidal or have kind of serious problems, they find that this is viewed as misinformation
Hmm.
and the group gets shut down.
Hmm.
And that was probably most obvious during the COVID pandemic. The internet really looked like a force for social control
Yes.
rather than something that was liberating us to be able to
Yeah.
work out what might be happening to us. Now, having said that, there's a change in the internet going on just at the moment. We now have a version of AI, and that really does more than let us search things. It really throws a lot of, as opposed to us having to hunt for the information, it's throwing a lot of information at us.
Hmm.
And in many respects, it does create the kind of situation where if you're on a drug, and it isn't just the SSRI group of drugs, this is true for all drugs, and you go to your doctor having a problem on this drug, you can be armed with a huge amount of information without having to do too much hard work. You can know more about the drug that you're on than your doctor knows. So, in a sense, it is creating a situation where there has to be a different kind of conversation. My worry is that we may be facing a moment that's a little bit like the 2004 moment. We thought we had the internet, we thought it was going to democratize things, but we've ended up being controlled by it.
Yeah. Yeah.
AI has the possibility that it may open things up. Whether we're going to be able to seize the opportunity and really open things up or not is far less clear.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, there's a lot of uh, complicated dynamics that come with how these things unfold across history. So, for example, if we go back to the printing press analogy in the Protestant Reformation, yes, the general average effect of the printing press was that more books were published, more people had access to more things on average. But then, of course, this prompts business development in the form of, say, publishing houses starting, and they can take advantage of this to then sort of reconsolidate and re-centralize and thereby control what does and doesn't get published and what does and does not get read. And then, of course, later on, today, self-publishing is much more common now. So those publishing houses have less centralized control. And so these things sort of unfold and evolve in this sort of back and forth way over time. I think, as you're pointing out, on average, yes, the internet makes more information available to more people on average, but we've seen over the past few years, in the last decade or so, the way that social media platforms like Facebook can control and censor information, other platforms can do the same, and so there's this really rich dance that goes on between information democratization and decentralization, and then re-centralization and control in new forms through new technologies. And it's shaping information flow in complicated ways. But at the end of the day, sort of a common denominator here is that there's always going to be central the special interests that want to centralize, information flow as best they can to serve their own purposes, and then there will be other forces that want to sort of decentralize it to make it more widely available. And these things are always sort of in a kind of dance or competition with each other.
That's a really good way to put it. But let me introduce a story about the SSRI group of drugs that
Hmm.
may help give people a feel for the things we're talking about and what it is we need to be aiming at.
Yeah.
Okay. So, way back when you opened up this line of thinking, you said we moved from the Dark Ages to a more enlightened period. We had the scientific period. And we've got a lot of people who think about science and things like that. And within the mental health field, you had people like Freud and Jung and things like that. And it was very theory based. You were encouraged to test hypotheses to see what was going on, but it was very theory based. Now, medicine, curiously, sheds an interesting light on that view of science, which is if you go back and look at the history of medicine, it's fairly static from the time of the Greeks through to the American Civil War,
Hmm.
roughly. And you had a bunch of young guys thrown into the Civil War with no medical training, really, facing the carnage that was going on both sides, and developing modern surgery,
Hmm.
how to fix injuries people hadn't seen before. Previously, there have been swords and things like that, and people got stuck with swords or spears or maybe bayonets. But now they were being shot by bullets, and bones were being kind of fractured in ways that they hadn't been fractured before. And you'd a need to work out how to fix this, and with no theory telling you how to do it. It
Right.
was very much based on looking at what was happening to the person right in front of you and trying to work out what seemed to work and finding things. One of the things that was curious that had actually happened just a short while before that was we had the discovery of ether and its use for anesthesia. And people could do surgical operations that they hadn't been able to do before. They could remove legs in a way that could be done without too much trouble, too much pain, and things like that. And in the Civil War, they also learned that, well, we need to do it hygienically. And putting one thing and the other, surgery took off. Now, it's not theory based. It's based on doing the things that seem right in the moment, based on
Yeah.
the observations
Yeah.
right in front of you.
Using the evidence of your eyes and ears directly.
Yeah. And the other aspect to it, though, which is rarely touched on, is that, the military realized quite quickly that actually the side that was going to win the war was the one that was able to keep its soldiers alive. Up till then, and actually up till 1904, uh, there it had always been the case that in a war, more troops died from disease and injuries than died from enemy fire or enemy combat. The first country to have more people die from combat rather than illness, disease, and things like that was uh, uh, Japan fighting Russia in 1904. They beat the Russians, but also ended up with less troops dead. So that's been a thing that has stimulated a lot of action within the field of medicine, which up till 1945 or so was principally actually surgical and driven by the needs of the military more than anything else. Now,
Yeah. Yeah.
to an extent, that's still the same. We've got kind of surgery being done by robots. We've got um, uh, uh, surgery being done at a distance, because we need to be able to go into space. So we need to be able to operate on people who are hundreds of thousands of miles away and things like this. And these are all military needs. Now, let me go back. Around 1950, we begin to get the first drugs, not just mental health drugs, but across medicine. And they're rather like surgery. They're really not theory-based. People had theories about illnesses and things like that, and operating according to the theory, you bled people or purged them or things like this. That kind of theory went out. Uh, that kind of theory actually went out the window.
Yeah.
We began doing things with pills and observing what happened. Okay. And in the case of the SSRI group of drugs and all the drugs we have in the mental health field, first of all, you had a bunch of people who got Nobel Prizes because there were new machines. We could give people drugs, or we could give the drugs maybe to rats, things like that. And we had new machines which looked at plasma levels and brain levels and things like that. And the people who won the Nobel Prizes didn't win these prizes because they were actually awfully bright compared to the rest of us. They won the prizes because they were the first people who were able to observe new things. It was not theory driven. We ended up with a world that was being built from the ground up. With the SSRI group of drugs, we had an older set of antidepressant drugs, which all looked in theory to be the same kind of thing. They were built on on a molecular core where all of the drugs looked pretty much uh, uh, um, they looked pretty much the same, and that they should be doing much the same thing. But a man called Arvid Carlson, looking at these and listening to patients, heard some of the patients saying, "Well, this drug over here chills me out in a way that this one over there doesn't." And he was able to spot the fact, well, actually, the one that people seem to be saying this chills them out, this also acts on the serotonin system in a way that the one on the opposite side actually doesn't do. So why don't we try and make a drug that inhibits serotonin reuptake, but not norepinephrine reuptake,
Hmm.
and see what it looks like? Okay. And out of that, we get the SSRI group of drugs. Now, I'm getting close to the key points here, which is Carlson thought there's nothing wrong with uh, the serotonin system in people who are anxious or depressed or whatever. He thought you have a group of drugs like LSD that act on a normal kind of serotonin system and are going to cause some people to say, yes, that actually suits me and could be helpful. And other people will say, no, that really doesn't suit me and feels awful. So this was not a view of pills as curing an illness. It was a view of pills as things that could do useful things for some people, but not others. And if you ask Carlson, could SSRI drugs cause people to become suicidal? His answer was yes. And a few years later, he was faced with a group of people
What time period are
who
we in
had,
right now?
well, he created the first SSRI in the late 1970s.
Hmm.
Okay. And one of the key points there is that people looking at this now say, well, it was a very rational thing to do. It was very, in a sense, theory based, but no, it wasn't. It was based on looking at and listening to people and believing what people told him. Other people looking at the drugs we had beforehand thought they must all be doing much the same thing, whereas he was listening to people and operating on what he heard from them. So he creates the first SSRIs, and if you asked him, look, could these drugs make people suicidal? The answer was yes, they could. And he was faced some years later, about the 1990s, late 1990s, with a group of people who had OCD. And the SSRI group of drugs are great to treat OCD. But there was a group of these patients saying to him, look, your drugs don't suit us. They aren't helping the OCD. They make us feel suicidal. we find it's a lot better when we take nicotine. Now, I'm not an advocate for nicotine because my father died from lung cancer because he actually smoked too much. Okay, so I'm not saying to people listening in that you must race out and get nicotine. Okay, uh, but Carlson was looking at people and listening to them and said, okay, well, let's run a trial of nicotine in OCD in people who do poorly on SSRIs. And the outcome of the trial was, well, actually, yes, there's a very big group of people who have OCD where the first line treatment is SSRIs still, but actually nicotine does a lot, can be much more helpful to a load of people who've got OCD than an SSRI
Mhm.
can be.
When you say helpful, what exactly is it helping? Is it helping control their compulsions so they don't repetitiously do things over and over again?
Well, it's more a case, I think, of the reason so many people ended up taking nicotine was not because it's very addictive and you can't get off it. It's easier to get off nicotine than get off an SSRI.
Mm.
Uh, it was, people aren't totally crazy. When it became clear that that nicotine can kill you with kind of heart attacks, lung cancer, and things like that, people got a load more cautious about it. But they also were taking nicotine because it makes you less anxious.
Hmm.
It can calm
Hmm.
a lot of people down.
And
Not
and
all
at this
people.
sorry, at this time, when you say they were taking nicotine, was that in the form of smoked cigarettes?
Yes. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Yeah. But the point I'm trying to make here, and this is where people get awfully worked up. If I say to a liberal audience, people who vote for left-wing parties, people who
Hmm.
think we're making progress, we're moving into a world that's enlightened. If I say to them, look, the art of medicine is about bringing good out of the use of a poison, people hiss at me. They hold up the crucifix and garlic, saying, we aren't actually prepared to listen to this guy. If I say that about nicotine, they say, "Oh yeah, sure, yeah, it's a poison.
Hmm.
You'd be absolutely crazy to take it." But if you're a good doctor working with a person who has a problem, you can bring as much good out of the use of nicotine or alcohol or maybe cannabis or whatever as you can bring from an SSRI.
Hmm. And you're not
And it's
saying
based on
you're not saying like
it's
one's good and one's bad, one's holy and one's evil. You're saying they both have upsides and downsides, and they can be used as tools according to the patient's needs.
well, the yeah, yes. A little bit of what I'm saying is that we're all different.
Yeah.
Okay. There were the people who thought Freud was great and the kinds of things he said worked for them, and lots of other people were, more inclined to figure, well, actually, the stuff we're hearing from Jung is great, better than what we're hearing from Freud, and that line of thinking suits us. Loads of other people then think that CBT is useful for them. None of the, I mean, I can see the appeal behind all of these three uh, kind of therapies. None of them work for me.
Hmm. Hmm.
The point I'm making is that we're all different. And the key to me helping you or you helping me is to be able to listen and look and observe. You do not want to be going to a doctor who is theory bound, who has a view about what the right answer is. The right answer for you, or the one that's going to help you, really involves me being able to look at you, listen to you, and possibly look at and listen to you over a period of time to see the changes that there have been if we introduce this drug or this therapy. If I can see changes in you over a period of days or weeks or whatever, that's the kind of thing that we need to build on rather than adhering to the Bible or the New England Journal of Medicine or the theory.
Hmm.
Now, that's what medicine introduces into the way we think about things. There are ethical issues that go with it. There are things about, well, is it a good idea to be using nicotine to treat nervous problems, which are a bit like using ether? You can do kind of surgery if we've got ether that you can't do without it. But also, there is a risk that using anesthesia to this day can kill you.
Hmm.
So we're taking a risk on killing you in order to try and to achieve a greater good.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's not theory bound. It's just it is a good idea to help you if we can.
yeah. I think one of the things worth exploring here is, what the nature of evidence is in the modern biomedical era. So, does the subjective report of a person count as legitimate evidence? You know, some people might say, some people refer to what individuals say as anecdotes. That's not data. To what extent should we count someone's word? Rather than relying solely on the results of large trials where you're averaging lots of people together and calculating p-values and these things. What do you do in a case where a person, say, gets prescribed a medication and they say it affects them in some strange way that deviates from what the average outcome is in the big studies? Is that an anecdote, or do you count that as real data? I think probably different people have different opinions on how you should weight a person's personal subjective report.
Yeah, okay. And let me take you back to a man called Austin Bradford Hill, who was the one who ran the first randomized control trial, the
Mm-hmm.
first RCT. And his view was you should put more weight on the subjective report of the person that you're treating than on an RCT. RCTs give you averages. They don't tell you what to do for the person right in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
And your job, if you're trying to help the person right in front of you, is to pay heed to them. And of course, they're a privileged source of information on what's happening to them that you ignore at their peril and your own peril too. Well, I should change that a little bit. If you're a pilot on a plane and I'm trying to get you from New York to the West Coast, uh, and you spot something kind of wrong with the plane, I'm going to pay heed to you because if you're right, we're both going to die if we don't fix it. In medicine, of course, it isn't like that. If you're right and the drug is going to kill you if I don't change things, if I pay no heed to you, you're going to die, but I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a different situation. So in your, I mean, and that's a little bit of the problem we have at the moment, which is increasingly with what's called evidence-based medicine, which is we're going to go by the results of randomized controlled trials. Uh, People are being lost. What's happening to the person right in front of a doctor gets lost. The doctors not paying heed, not looking at closely, not listening closely to, not there's no continuity of input either, which is sort of awfully helpful. If I've seen you before, if I've seen you the week before you actually went on these pills and you come in to see me now, and I can spot the difference in you, either good or bad, that's crucial. I may actually, I mean, I have to open the door to you being able to let me know what's going on. Often people they've been told that they have to take these drugs, the SSRI group of drugs, for weeks before they'll be sure that they're actually working or not. Carlson's view and my view about these drugs is if they're not suiting you within the first 24 hours, you should stop them.
Hmm.
But people go on these drugs, they begin to think weird thoughts, they don't feel good. Uh, the um, the doctor these days is inclined to say, well, this is your illness getting worse.
Mm.
Or, you're actually more ill than I thought you were. Maybe we need
Mm.
to increase the dose of these pills, or maybe we need to add other
Mm.
pills in. Let me
Yeah.
tell you two quick things on that scope. I did a healthy volunteer trial with the SSRI group of drugs. When I say I did, I ran a healthy volunteer trial, and a bunch of my uh, my my a bunch we recruited a lot of the nursing staff and the medical staff in the unit in which I was working to the actual trial. And there was two different drugs that could be on, one of which was an SSRI and the other of which had no actions on the serotonin system at all. Okay. And the idea with the trial was to try and work out, was Arvid Carlson right? Was a drug that acts on the serotonin system going to chill people out in a way that a drug that's an antidepressant, which didn't act on the serotonin system, wouldn't do? And the answer is that he was right. But here's the interesting bit. Um, the patients in the unit in which we did this trial, from which we recruited the nursing staff, medical staff, and things like that, within 24 to 48 hours, they were coming up to me and saying, "Is that doctor on a pill?" And I was actually surprised because they didn't know this was happening. Okay. And the answer was, well, yes. And they're able to say to me, "Is he on an SSRI?" And I was saying, yes, probably. You know, the thing was they were observing the staff in a way that the staff don't observe them
Hmm.
anymore. They're operating on theory. They're operating on the basis of, well, if you aren't well after, a week or two, we have to wait for up to 6 weeks to, and then you'll actually recover. The patients could spot what happens to people and had learned. They had an expertise we didn't have
Hmm.
based on observing people on these pills. And the same thing happens in prisons.
Hmm.
I was interviewing a man recently who's in jail. He'd been on an SSRI and things went wrong. And he was able to say to me, the other prisoners can pick out who is on an SSRI and who
Hmm.
isn't without being told.
And
So,
can they do that very soon after they start the SSRI?
well, they can tell people who are on SS. I mean, first of all, the patients could tell within roughly 24 to 48 hours after the person had been, after the nurse or maybe the doctor had begun taking an SSRI. They
Yeah.
could tell, yes, we can see that this person's on these drugs. And actually, based on what they alerted me to, I've become able to spot
Hmm.
people who are
Hmm.
on
Hmm.
SSRIs pretty
So
quickly as
basically, it
well.
sounds like what you're saying here is that human beings, by observing each other in face-to-face real-world interactions, they can tell when someone's on an SSRI within a day or two of them starting to take it, even if the clinical manifestations of the potential antidepressant effect haven't shown up yet, because those often take weeks to manifest.
The antidepressant effect is there from the start.
Mm.
It's either a good effect, it's what Arthur Carlson said. Look, there's going to be a chill out effect,
Yeah, yeah.
or there's not. And
Oh,
people can say within 1 or 2 days, yeah, this drug is doing a useful thing for me, and I can see how it could be helpful. Or they can say, no, I haven't getting anything out of this. Or
oh,
the effect, maybe I feel a chill effect, but it isn't something that I like.
I see. So this a standard story, a common story that I've read about and heard about in academic settings about SSRIs, it goes like this. Um, on average, the antidepressant effects of SSRIs in those people for whom that effect will manifest can take several weeks to manifest. And this has something to do with, the slow time course of neuroplastic changes being induced. And that's why it takes a few weeks for the antidepressants to show up when they do show up. You're saying that effects manifest much sooner than that.
It's a bit like alcohol or nicotine or benzodiazepines or whatever. The effect of these drugs is fairly obvious fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be a good effect. And it's not the thing that cures you. Most people who get SSRI drugs, okay, are people who have a problem that's going to resolve spontaneously anyway.
Hmm.
So the cure, so-called, is not being brought about by the pill. The pill just makes things more comfortable for a period of time, or
Mm,
else it makes things a lot worse.
I see.
It can do either.
I see. So
Uh,
something in your life is happening. It's making you sad, basically. But that thing will usually resolve. That stimulus will usually go away. And the SSRI, in some cases, can make that intervening period more bearable. but it's actually the stimulus in your life going away that will actually cause your sadness to resolve, basically. And the SSRI can be a tool to make that intervening period more bearable, basically.
Yes, exactly. And let me bring out a thing here, which comes back to the issue about, does it make sense to pay heed to what you tell me is happening to you on the pill, or should we just go by what the RCTs say?
Mm-hmm,
Okay.
mm-hmm.
And the randomized controlled trials of these drugs compared these drugs to placebo. And they show that over a period of 6 to 8 weeks, yes, there are some people who seem to recover, but it may take about 6 weeks. Well, yes, the recovery can take about 6 weeks, but that doesn't mean that it's anything to do with the acute action of the SSRI. But the
Mm,
other point that comes into play here is people look at the data from these RCTs and say, well, the effect of the SSRIs is pretty weak. They only just about beat uh, 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 the um, the
placebo.
the placebo effect.
Yeah.
And people can go on to say, well, maybe most of the effect of the SSRI group of drugs is a placebo effect. Okay, now there is a sense in which that's right, which is that the part of the placebo effect is just the natural recovery effect.
Yeah. And I
Okay,
imagine it also has to
but
do with the fact that, if you're entering a situation where you're going to see a doctor, you know that you're being cared for by someone who's paying attention to you. Like all of those things have a sort of what you might call a natural healing component because, you're not just off on your own. You're being cared for.
yeah, not quite, not quite. No, if you don't go to a doctor at all
Hmm.
and you get well after 8, 10, 12 weeks or whatever, you're more resilient and less likely to get ill again in as a future. So natural healing works by natural healing.
Hmm.
Once you get involved with the healthcare system, it's not going to be particularly natural healing anymore. People are going to do things to you which, in uh, at the long run, may be unhelpful. But when we talk about the placebo effect, people think we're kind of talking about things that are in your mind. If you talk to people who are on an SSRI, either getting a good effect out of them, they say, no, this effect isn't all in my mind. This is a very real effect. And if you talk to people who have a bad effect on them, they say, absolutely no, this is not all in my mind. This is a terribly real thing that's that's actually happening to me. So I think we've got our discourse about what SSRIs do very badly mixed up, but also our discourse about what randomized controlled trials do badly mixed up, because it's not just a case of the SSRI barely beats placebo. One of the other interpretations you can put on the results from randomized controlled trials is there's a bunch of people who are suited to SSRIs
Yeah.
and a bunch who aren't. And all things being equal, roughly only about half of us are actually suited to these drugs, and the other half of us aren't. So that's why the difference between the two arms of the RCT isn't that great. It's
Right.
nothing to do with the placebo effect or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just that you're failing to sort people based on their baseline differences.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you could say, well, look, what we're aiming to do is uh, to um, to see if this drug causes you to chill out. Okay. Uh, and if that's what we did in the clinical trial, we would only need to run the trial for a week. We wouldn't
Right.
need to run it for kind of 6 weeks or more. But part of the reason we ran the kinds of trials we did is because the pharmaceutical industry spotted the fact that, well, if our drugs can be shown to beat placebo, in a 6 week trial in people who are depressed, rather than selling the drug, we can sell depression. We can make everyone depressed. And rather than saying, well, our drug just about works and maybe you shouldn't be taking it if you don't feel that it's really helping you out, we can say, no, the trial has shown it works. End of story. There should be no argument about this. The science says this works, and are you going to believe the science or are you going to believe the anecdote? This person who's saying, no, this drug doesn't work for me.
Mhm. So talk to me a little bit more about. So you give someone an SSRI. There are acute effects that are felt right away. What do those look like when the person is suited to the SSRI versus when they don't? Can you be just specific and concrete about how that manifests in that first 24 to say 48-hour window?
Yeah, let me take you back to the first 30-minute
Hmm.
window,
Hmm.
okay? Which is one of the interesting things about the SSRIs is, as I said to you, Arthur Carlson had this view that they work on the serotonin system, and they may suit some people and not suit others, like LSD. Uh, Unlike LSD, which enhances sensory input so that people hear things and see things in more acute detail and often appreciate it much more. Uh, SSRIs do just the opposite. They tune things down. They make us sensorily less
Hmm.
reactive.
Yeah.
They numb us. Now, one of the interesting things about RCTs is you hear that, well, these drugs have a primary endpoint that RCTs operate on the basis of having a primary endpoint. We want to show these drugs are going to improve your score on a depression rating scale. And all of the interviews and everything about the whole trial is heavily focused in on this. And we're able to show that, yes, on average, we have an improvement in people who are on the SSRI compared with people who aren't on the SSRI. And you get told that the side effects of these drugs, well, they're either rarer than the primary effect. We've got a positive benefit risk ratio for the pill because we know that the benefits happening in most people who are on the pill, that is your mood's going to be helped, and the problems are less common than that. And they may actually be ones that only come on after a period of time, after a period of time that lies outside the duration of the RCT, and that's the reason that we just didn't pick them up. So that's the model most people have, but it's completely wrong. If you take an SSRI, the first thing that happens to you within 30 minutes of a first pill is you become genitally numb. From a sensory point of view, you have become numb and you
Hmm.
don't feel uh, the genital area is
Hmm.
numbed compared
Yeah.
with what it was
That area in
before.
particular stands out.
Well, that's the area that people have been most focused on. Some people become genitally numb. We can show that they're genitally numb, but they're not particularly aware of it.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm. So another way of saying this is that an area of the body which is normally quite sensitive to sensory inputs becomes less sensitive to sensory inputs.
Yes, and it's not just genitals, it's your skin in general.
Yes. Yes.
It's kind of, there's
Yeah.
less sensory input
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
the body generally.
So.
And this is interpreted by people as becoming emotionally numb.
Mm,
The sensory input is damped down.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they actually describe this as being emotionally numb rather
Hmm.
than sensorily
Yeah.
numbed.
What's interesting about that to me, given my neuroscience background and some of the things I know here, is what you're describing is what people report from their
Yeah.
senses. What we know, I'm going to sort of compress and simplify the neuroscience on this, but what people have been discovering the last few years, especially around the serotonin system in mammals generally, is that one of the core functions of serotonin signaling is to gate sensory information. It sort of tunes how much what you might call raw sensory information goes deeper into the brain and gets further processed. And so it fits quite well, I think, with what you're telling me.
Mm. Yeah. No, 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 sure. But let me push this a bit further. Okay. Yeah. I got involved in looking at the serotonin system way, way back. And if you ask me while I was doing why I did all this, I'd actually, first of all, done medicine. But thought before I go into the mental health field, it would be a good idea to do some research. And yeah, the serotonin system was just vaguely coming on the map at that time. And, uh, having an interest in therapy, actually talking to people, it was a little bit odd to be in a pharmacology lab looking at things like the serotonin system. And if you asked me why I was doing it, I would have said, well, I'm interested in the philosophical problem about how the mind fits into the brain.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, in particular, I was interested in how the female mind works, basically. But, hey, I've realized that it's the issue we've got is not how does the mind fit into the brain? The brain is almost irrelevant. It's how does the mind fit into the body?
Mm.
Because, and, uh, the serotonin system brings the point out quite well, which is only roughly 5% of the serotonin in you and me is in what we call our brain, and it's in the reptilian bit of the brain, the ancient bit of the brain. If you look at what we think of as the human brain, the cortex and things like that, there's some nerve endings there, but there's no serotonin based there. 95% of the serotonin in you and me is in our bodies. And it's linked principally to the sensory system. And as you say, what it does is it gates things. And you can open the gate with LSD and flood the brain with all sorts of things. If you chat to people who are into LSD and things like that, they talk about the mind a lot and at the brain a lot. They don't ever think that LSD may be acting on the rest of the body.
Hmm. Yes.
The visual effects, they think, well, these are all in the brain. There's a lot of serotonin in our eyes, which is not part of our brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
nobody stops to think about maybe the effects of LSD are as much in the eyes as anywhere else. With SSRIs, they have huge visual effects. And talking to ophthalmologists, they assume this is all to do with the brain because we've been marketed to, we've been told the serotonin in your brain is low when your mood is wrong, and these drugs top that up. There's no serotonin that's abnormal in the brain when we get clinically depressed. Once we take these drugs, your serotonin is going to be a lot more abnormal than it was beforehand.
Hmm. Yeah.
But the effects of these drugs, when you listen to people and things like that, they've got visual problems, they've got genital problems, they have sexual dysfunction that may last
Yeah.
for the rest of their life after they halt the
Yeah.
drug.
So,
You
so
know,
the acute effects, literally the first pill that you feel results in many people in this genital numbing effect, this dampening of sensation. What are the specific visual issues that people report?
yeah, well, one of the things that's on the radar these days is a thing called visual snow
Hmm.
syndrome. And that's comprised of a bunch of different things. First of all, people have flecks of white. They've got what we used to actually describe with old style
Hmm.
TV
Like
sets
static
was
in their visual field.
you've got static. Yeah. The other thing that goes with it is that you've got night blindness that you can't really make things out. If your job involves having to drive a car at night, you're in trouble.
Hmm. So
You've also
SSRIs
got
are basically elevating.
alanopsia. Have you heard of this one?
No.
Yeah, that's after images. You
Hmm.
know, um, you've got you see the thing you're looking at, and then you close your eyes and you see
Hmm.
after images going on for ages. You've got a bunch of different things that are actually happening to your visual system, but they're the things that are most clear cut.
And those things show up right away in the first day.
No, 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 they don't. They may show up only after a period of time, but they also may endure after you've halted the
Hmm.
pills for the rest of your life, just like your sexual problems.
Hmm. What percentage, roughly speaking, can you give us a sense for, okay, if the most acute effects, the ones that show up immediately, the dampening of sensation in the genitals, is that rare? Is that common? Can you give us a sense for how common that is?
That happens close to 100% of people.
Really?
Yeah, and this brings out um, you know,
So
the
whether or not they're going
problems
to
of
end
what
up
we're being.
having the antidepressant endpoint, that's something that you tend to see in almost everyone right away.
Yes, and you're told by FDA, well, the thing that's most common is that these drugs help you. The problems are quite rare compared with that. So there's a benefit risk ratio that's favorable to taking the pills. That's all wrong. You
Wow.
know, you may be helped by the pill. You absolutely will be generally affected by the pill. And you aren't being told about this. Um, it isn't just that. I mean, you get numb kind of genitals, your orgasms mute, and over a period of time, you lose libido. But also over a period of time, if you're male, your sperm count goes to the floor. If you're female and you get pregnant, there's a much greater chance that you're going to miscarry or that there are going to be things wrong with uh, uh, the the fetus
Wow.
in the womb.
I mean, maybe it's a coincidence, but I know someone who just a few months ago started SSRIs and then not so long after that um, got pregnant and miscarried.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Okay, but you're saying this genital muting,
miscarriages can happen anyway,
right?
but
Right. Yeah,
yeah,
maybe it's a
no,
coincidence.
no, sure, but yeah, the pills double the rate of
Double the
miscarriages.
rate. Wow. And then it affects sperm counts in men.
Yes, yeah, they go to the floor.
Wow. And so, I mean, there's a number of places we can go from here, but the key thing I guess worth emphasizing and repeating is there are reliable effects seen in almost all people who take SSRIs that show up right away, first dose.
Absolutely, yeah, and they're more common than the supposed benefit,
Yes.
which isn't the kind of thing that you
Mm-hmm.
get to hear. I mean, you find people who come into the doctor and saying, these pills don't suit me, there are genital issues or whatever. And the doctor responds by saying, well, that must be because you're depressed. Your
Right, right,
depression
right.
causes loss of libido. The kinds of people that go to a doctor and get put on an SSRI don't have a depression in the sense of a condition that's very severe and will cause your libido to drop. But way back when the uh, first antidepressant group of drugs came on stream in the late 1950s, early 1960s, some of those inhibited serotonin reuptake also. We were only using them in people who had what's called melancholia, people who were profoundly depressed,
Yeah.
and otherwise they were going to get ECT. Okay. Doctors giving them then could notice the fact, well, this person has loss of libido linked to their illness. When I treat them with these pills, the pills are also causing loss of libido. Doctors these days can't do that.
Right.
They don't listen to the patient. They don't believe what they're being told, which is, Doc, a week ago, before you put me on these pills, my libido was great. The
Yeah.
only thing that was keeping
Yeah.
me going was I still had
Yeah.
libido.
I was
You're
feeling a bit
now killing
anxious
it.
because work is
Yes,
stressful, but I
yes,
had a
exactly.
libido. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, sure.
Wow.
Hmm.
Interesting. So from your perspective, based on your experience, when people go on SSRIs, what should they look for in the first 24 hours to tell them to stop versus continue with the SSRIs? Is there a clear cut answer to that in your view?
Well, I think the thing is you need to ask yourself, do I figure that this pill is actually suiting me in the sense of, is there a good effect? Am I less reactive? One of my friends actually at the doctor that the patients were able to spot is on an SSRI, he was able to say to me things like, well, yeah, it is interesting. You walk down the stairs and the kids, they often have their shoes thrown around the place. And if I'm in bad form, I might give out to them. Uh, but now on the drug, he'd walk down the stairs and the shoes could be all over the place and he'd sail by without being bothered.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's the kind of thing, in a sense, we're looking for. If you don't have something like that, you shouldn't really be on these pills. you know.
Yeah.
So you're the one who needs to be able to judge, is it producing an effect which could be useful? And if it's an effect which could be useful, do you appreciate it?
Yeah.
If you don't, again, maybe it's not for you.
Yeah. I think I fully comprehend what you're saying here, but I'm going to ask you this anyway, just to bring it home for people. So this notion that the antidepressant effects of SSRIs is delayed and takes 6 or 8 weeks or whatever to show up. You're saying basically basically there's a real issue with that, and you shouldn't need to wait that long, and that you can sort of discern whether these things are directionally probably going to work or not very much sooner than that.
Yes, and let me add two more things into it, which is your family needs to know about it. You know, your partner, your kids, your parents, whatever, because they'll be able to spot things as well.
Right. Things
And
that
they'll
you
be
might
able
not
to spot,
notice.
yeah, and they'll be able to spot, is this actually suiting you or not? And
Right.
they'll often actually describe, well, you've had a change of personality,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it isn't one that we like all that
I
much, you
see.
know.
Yeah.
But there is a further aspect to all this, which is when the companies began doing RCTs on these drugs, they became aware pretty early on it was going to be tricky to show that they worked. You know, they had to be awfully careful. They couldn't recruit people who were very severely depressed because SSRIs aren't particularly good for people who are severely depressed. Okay. Um, so they needed to recruit a bunch of people where the placebo response is going to be pretty high. People who are
Right.
mildly
Mildly
depressed.
depressed.
Okay.
Yeah.
But in order to be absolutely sure they were going to get a positive result, they introduced the drugs at a toxic dose level. When we hear the the fact that Prozac is in a 20 milligram dose, to a lot of doctors and a lot of other people, that sounds like a low dose. That's a toxic dose of
What do
Prozac.
you mean by
Lilly
toxic?
Lilly did trials which showed that 5 milligrams was just as good as a 20 milligram dose.
Eli Lilly.
Eli Lilly, yeah. It's when you use a 20 milligram dose of Prozac, you are occupying all of the serotonin reuptake sites beyond the point where it's doing any good.
Hmm.
So if we were operating on the basis of saying to people, look, you should only be on these drugs if you get an effect at a 5 milligram dose that you figure suits you. Okay. Um, we shouldn't be giving you a huge dose in order to try and knock you out almost, you know.
What's a
Um,
normal
that,
starting dose that would get prescribed to someone?
well, uh, at a normal dose of Prozac, which was the only dose you could get for years and years, was the 20 milligram
I
dose.
see. So it
You
started that
couldn't
way
get
because they
a
designed the
five
trials that
milligram.
way because they wanted to maximize the probability of seeing an effect in people with mild depression because the whole thing was being engineered to try and get the outcome they wanted.
Yes.
And so
Um,
initially everything was done on 20 milligrams. And so
yes.
that was the only game in town, even though we later figured out that five
Well,
was
it's
just as
not
a
later. It isn't later.
oh
They did trials on the 5 milligram dose before it was marketed and had just as good a result. But in terms of what they were going to show FDA, they figured we're not going to take any chances with a 5 milligram dose. We're going to just go with
wow.
at the 20 milligram dose. And also, part of the marketing afterwards was, well, let's make it simple for doctors. Just one dose,
One dose,
one
20 for
pill,
everyone.
one dose. That's all you do.
Right,
You
because
know,
that's
it
probably going to be most conducive to um, using it as widely as
doctors
possible.
being willing to use it. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
So this brings us to another issue I wanted to ask you about. So Eli Lilly had data on the 5 milligrams and the 20 milligrams, but they didn't have to show all of it to FDA. How does that piece of all of this work in terms of pharmaceutical companies do these trials, they do this research, but they don't have to show or share all the data even with the FDA?
Yeah, well, you need to ask yourself, what do FDA do? And FDA are a bunch of bureaucrats. They're a bit like the Federal Aviation Authority, the FAA, who get the paperwork from Boeing. about the latest plane, and they're just looking at the paperwork. They're not flying the airplane. They're not involved in the design of the airplane. They're just trying to tick boxes, have Boeing done the kinds of things that they ought to be doing. And the FAA are only interested in a useful paper trail.
Yeah. Have you
What
fulfilled the requirements of the protocol?
of the protocol? Sure. In terms of keeping people safe afterwards on this plane, FAA have nothing to do with it. It's the pilot who, as I say, uh, if things go wrong with this plane or with the system of all the planes going in and out of airports and things like that, and the pilot gets worried, he or she will say, well, look, until this is fixed, I'm not going to fly again. And all of her colleagues are going to say the same thing. You must fix this or we ain't going to fly again. Doctors don't do that. In theory, they're in the same position as pilots, which is they're the people who are going to keep you safe. This drug has gone, I mean, there's a bunch of paperwork that has gone into FDA. FDA have ticked boxes. They haven't got in touch with the patients recruited to the trial. They don't even know if all the patients in the trial supposedly exist. They certainly don't know that they've got all the trials that the company did. They don't look at the healthy volunteer trials, which are, the ones that are really going to show what the drug does. If we have a trial where we give this drug to people who are anxious or people who are depressed, yeah, there can be a bit of confusion if people become suicidal. Well, depression can cause that as well. But if you give these drugs to healthy volunteers and they become suicidal and commit suicide, which they have done,
Right.
it's difficult to blame the illness.
Right.
Okay, but FDA don't look at these healthy
Right.
volunteer
I
trials.
mean,
They
it's,
read some paperwork and tick a bunch of boxes. Uh,
I mean, it basically
and
sounds like what you're saying is that the FDA, they do their job in the sense of the paperwork is submitted to them by drug companies, and they will read the paperwork, they will look at the paperwork, they will make sure it's filled out properly, but there's no sort of extra or further investigation of whether or not the paperwork is tied to reality, if it's actually what it says it is. There's not a lot of looking under the hood beyond what's submitted.
yeah, it's very much a case of FDA are there to license the use of certain words.
Hmm.
It's the Food and Drugs Agency. So one company can bring them some brand stuff which they want to call chocolate.
Yeah.
And FDA have a criterion for chocolate, which is it's got to have so much cocoa kind of
Wow.
solids in it.
I've never
If
quite
you've
thought of it
got
this
that,
way. It's an agency
if
that is regulating the use of language.
yeah, if you've got the right amount of cocoa solids, you can use the word chocolate. But FDA aren't in the business of saying this is good chocolate. Okay. The company that wants to market this as chocolate are the ones that are going to go out there and try and persuade you that our chocolate's much better than any other chocolate you can get. Okay. It's the same with butter. They've FDA have got a slab of yellow stuff. Is it butter? Well, it depends on the animal fat content, whether we're going to let you use the word butter or not. But FDA aren't going to tell you if it's healthy or not to take
Right.
butter. It's doctors who are going to maybe work at this. It's a bit the same with, well, it is the same with all of the antidepressants and every other group of drugs. If you want to use the word antihypertensive, FDA have a criterion. It must lower blood pressure. If you want to use the word antidepressant, they have a criterion, which is it must lower a rating scale score. It's not keep you alive. It's not save lives. It's almost nothing that goes through FDA that saves lives.
Really.
Yeah. There are more people die on antidepressants in the trials submitted to FDA and antipsychotics than die on placebo.
And you're saying that a lot of that, the reason that's happening, a big piece of the reason that's happening is the way that people die. It's like what you said with the SSRIs and depression. It's like, oh, they committed suicide. Well, that was because of their depression, not because of the medication for the depression.
Well, that's the way the company can play things afterwards. FDA are just bureaucrats. Their job is not to think.
Yeah.
It's to make sure that when things go wrong, we have a paperwork trail that means you can't shoot us. You can't take us out and shoot us,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Wow. And so how much, like, what can you tell me about, so let's just assume that my listeners have a basic idea of the biopharmaceutical pipeline, right? You have to do preclinical research. You've got a drug candidate, and then you do your phase 1, 2, 3 trials and so forth. You eventually get approval. The what we're led to believe is that if something is an approved drug, the science is rock solid, the clinical trial results all looked good, and sort of all of the results were analyzed. What can you start to tell us about how the data is sort of massaged along the way, how certain pieces of evidence are maybe left out that aren't even analyzed, such that it looks like all of the evidence looks good and you tick all the boxes at the FDA and then you get approval, but in fact all the evidence was not even looked at in some cases.
Yeah. In what you need to appreciate, I think, is that the studies companies do to get a license are essentially assays. They're not randomized controlled trials. They're randomized and they're controlled that way, but they're assays rather than trials done to inform clinical practice. And as I say, they get the paperwork into FDA who don't check if all of the people in this trial uh, um, actually existed or not. Okay. Uh, if you were FDA and really working hard at the job, you'd imagine, you'd look at the paperwork and, you'd notice, hey, this guy in this trial died from burns. Well, if you're just working through the paperwork, you can say, people die from burns. You have accidents that happen in any group of a few hundred people. The companies are supposed to write an account which gives the person in FDA a bit more detail if a patient has died from burns or has ended up going into hospital for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of the Pfizer trials, I should probably hop back and just introduce this note for you, okay? When Zoloft launched in the UK, I chaired one of the launch meetings for Pfizer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um, that was at a point before I knew what I'm going to tell you next. Okay. But at the launch meeting, I thought, what I what I'm what I'd say is, look, this group of drugs are new, and the serotonin system is pretty primitive, and we're going to learn things by using these drugs that we didn't ever know before. And I thought this seemed to be a reasonable thing to be saying. It's going to be exciting. Life is going to be fun. We're going to see new things, which will kind of provide the basis for new drugs. This was just after Viagra had been discovered by Pfizer, by a bunch of people who, when Pfizer thought the trial didn't work all that well for heart problems, a bunch of guys weren't happy to give the drugs back because they'd noticed it was doing something interesting for them.
Yeah.
So I was trying to play on that theme. Things could be interesting here. We're going to see things we haven't ever seen before. But anyway, um, FDA aren't looking at it like this. What is there in this dossier that's going to tell me things I didn't know about medicine beforehand? Okay. Um, so you've got guy dies from burns in a Pfizer trial. And when things like this happen, the company are supposed to write things up to explain a bit more. Okay. Uh, it looks pretty clear that FDA didn't look closely at the whole thing. They just said, oh, death by burns. When you read the account of what happened, you find this guy became agitated on one of the drugs and wanted to kill himself and poured gasoline over himself and set fire to it.
Mm.
But he only died 5 days later
Wow.
and gets coded as death by burns rather than death by suicide.
Wow.
Now, that's the kind of thing that should be happening. And if people in FDA were awake, they'd be reading these things and saying, hey, wait a minute here, I need to get hold of this guy's wife and get a little bit more from her about what went on. But they
Mm-hmm.
don't have the contact details for people. Actually, I've got a great story I can tell you
Yeah.
about that. But anyway, let me just add one more thing in first, which is, in theory, Pfizer have to, write an account of what happened to this man who died from burns. But around the time he died from burns, they realized, there's other things we can do. Not just them, but all of the companies realize, you know, if we've got a kid going on an SSRI, as one kid actually down in Texas going on Paxil, a week or two later, he's out in the street waving a gun around, threatening to kill people. So he gets picked up by the police and gets brought to hospital. So there should be an account of what happened. There isn't. Technically, if you've got an adverse event on the drug, there has to be an account of what happened.
Hmm.
But if you're GSK, as it was in this case, and you decide, well, this kid, he must have had bipolar disorder and we just didn't realize it, and he shouldn't have been in this trial at all to begin with,
Throw them out.
you don't have to write anything. You just throw him out of the trial and he disappears. And in this trial, where 87 people actually go on Paxil, and there's more people actually going on Paxil who become suicidal and have behavioral changes than on the placebo, there were 4 kids that disappear like
Hmm.
this, all taking Paxil.
Wow.
But FDA to this day know nothing about it.
Basically, what you're
So
saying is the technicalities involved here allow companies to throw out data by, what we'll just call these tricks, and that makes the data look better than it actually is.
yes, and furthermore, coming back to the issue about RCTs and the do we pay more heed to the RCT are the reports from the person. One of the things that I've been actually involved with for ages now is post-SSRI sexual dysfunction, PSSD as it's
Yeah.
called. Okay,
Yeah.
and one of the person that put this on my radar first a quarter of a century ago. Okay, she came into me one day, this lady, and I can still see her. And she told me, "Look, I'm not able to make love since I was on this pill." And I said, "Sure, these things happen. But once you come off the pill, things will be fine." And she looked at me and she said, "I've been off this pill for 3 months,
Hmm.
and I can take a hard bristled brush and rub it up and down my genitals and feel nothing." Okay. So my response was, holy fuck, basically. Anyway, uh, and at that point, I mean, still, we had no treatment for her. Okay. Um, but here's the point I'm trying to make. Around the time she came into me, the companies up till then, when you were on any of these pills and something like this happened to you, you got in touch with a company doctor. Either your doctor got in touch with the company doctor, or you got in touch with the company doctor and said, "Look, I'm gently numb and I've been off this pill." And, it all began when I was on the pill. It's still there now, months later. And the doctor would try and work out whether there was any other way to explain, the problem other than the company drug had actually caused it. Okay. And they routinely, well, not routinely, but they often actually decide, company doctors actually decided based on interviewing you when you said something like, "I can take a hard bristle brush and rub it up and down my genitals and feel nothing," that there's no other way to explain it, given that their drug can do this to begin with when you go on it, and there's no condition in medicine that causes this,
Yeah.
people to be gently numb like this,
Yeah. You can't just
that
say,
there's
"Oh,
no other
that's your
way to
depression."
explain it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But around this time, this is the year 2000, companies had begun arguing in court that the only material that counts is the randomized control trial material. If it's not in the randomized control, if it didn't control trial, if it didn't show up there, then it doesn't exist. Our drug's not causing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You can basically disappear evidence.
Yeah. But what the legal teams working for the pharmaceutical industry realized at this point was, well, if that's our argument in court, we can't let company doctors decide, in the case of this anecdote, that the company drug has caused it. they've got to say, we've had a report of someone becoming gently numb, and we're going to pass it on to FDA.
Mm.
Okay. Now, years later, I get involved in trying to collect lots of material on people who've got PSSD. And one of the things about people with PSSD is until awfully recently, nobody wanted to let anyone else in the entire universe know that they'd got PSSD. It was a bit like having AIDS, you know. You didn't want to let anyone know that you had this problem. So they weren't happy at letting their names out. But I had reports on 80 people who were happy when I told them what we were going to do was we were going to send the reports we have. What we'd like to do is send the reports we have on everybody who's got PSSD to the European regulator and to FDA. And we'd like you to leave your names on it. And we'd like you to consult a doctor, also your doctor, the one who put you on these pills, and ask him or her to write a note as well, saying, well, you know, we don't know if the drug has caused it, but we can't see any other way to explain it.
Hmm.
Okay, so we got about 30 or 40 doctors doing that as well, and 80 people leaving their names on it, which was a big thing for them to do at this point. So we sent the material to FDA, who are still sitting on it 5 or 6 years later. We sent the material to the European regulator, whom I happened to know at the time. Okay, so I was able to get in touch with them and say, look, did you get all of the material? And he said, yes, they did. And that I'd be pleased to know that they, as per procedure, when they got all this material, the first thing they did was to remove everybody's name.
Hmm.
They were told in the covering letter, the reason you're getting people's names is so you can contact them. Here's their email address, here's the phone number, in order to work out. We don't think you can decide the drug is causing the problem unless you interview people.
Wow.
FDA and EMA don't have anyone who can get in touch with anyone
So,
who reports things to
wow.
them.
So by manipulating procedural outcomes, this was prevented from, actually being investigated.
Yeah. Well,
Wow.
it actually comes back to the point, if you're going to decide on cause and effect, it's not randomized controlled trial that's going to do it for you. It really has to be an investigation, you know,
Mhm.
somebody actually
Yeah.
talking to you who knows a bit about medicine and knows a bit about the drug and says, well, the most reasonable explanation about what's happening here is this drug is causing this problem in this person.
Hmm. So,
It may be awfully rare,
yeah.
but yeah,
A theme
it,
of what you've been saying, I think, is that the bureaucrats in these agencies simply don't have incentives to be motivated to do investigation. They are simply going to process paperwork, and therefore they can be easily guided or manipulated by the clever use and engineering of paperwork by the people submitting it.
yeah, but to go even further, it's not the bureaucrat's responsibility to lead. You've got a bunch of professionals who make a living out of the fact that you can't get these drugs from anyone else other than from them. And it's their responsibility to be doing, to lead in this and to stand up and say, well, look, we aren't going to prescribe your drug anymore. Doctors, in a sense, are in an extraordinarily powerful position. If nobody can get the drugs other than them, can get the company drug other than them prescribing it, they have a hell of a lot of power over the company. Yeah, if they actually say, well, we're seeing a lot of people with PSSD, unless you tell us a little bit more about what's going on or when you realize this is happening first, and we include in the material that we give people an account of what the risks are, we aren't going to give this drug.
Hmm.
But they don't do it. And as a result, the only thing that makes doctors wake up slightly is when I say to them, look, if the drugs work as well as you say and are as free of problems as you say, you're going out of business. Nurses are cheaper prescribers, pharmacists are cheaper prescribers, and we'll have robotic prescribing soon.
Mhm. I want to ask you more about PSSD because I had people request this topic.
Yeah.
So post SSRI sexual dysfunction, you talked about the muting of general sensation that you said most people feel this right away on SSRIs. So for PSSD, let's start with the basics here. What is this in concrete terms, in terms of how it manifests? How common is it? And let's just start there.
Yeah. Well, close to 100% of people who take these drugs will have some genital numbing. Not everybody will be aware of it.
Mhm.
Most people will be. And it isn't just that they'll be aware of it. The story really takes off in the late 1960s, early 1970s when Ciba-Geigy, making a drug which we now know is a potent serotonin reuptake inhibitor, clomipramine, realized that the antidepressant dose of this was 150 milligrams, but in a 10 milligram dose, it could solve premature ejaculation problems for men by making their genitals that bit more numb.
Hmm.
And if you took the pill, a 10 milligram pill, just a fraction of the antidepressant dose, 30 minutes before you made love, you were going to have a much more successful time. And they put articles in the newspapers about how your partner is going to love you even more because she is going to think, wow, it was pretty depressing when he came so quickly, basically. So that was well known back in the early 1970s.
Wow.
It was well known in the early 1980s that, and I can remember a very arresting talk I was at, a behavior therapist in the UK called Isaac Marks, who figured that behavior therapy is the best treatment for OCD, was being muscled out, a bit worried about the fact that Ciba-Geigy were also marketing clomipramine for OCD, and it is a good treatment for OCD. Okay, and this is the drug from which the observations that it can make you less reactive came that led to the creation of the SSRI group of drugs. Anyway, clomipramine was muscling in on the OCD market, and Marx was not terribly keen on all this. And he said, there can be awful problems linked to this drug. He was treating a nun for OCD, and he said when they stopped the drug, she was left with permanent orgasms afterwards. So just the opposite, just the mirror image of PSSD, and it's what's called PGAD, persistent genital arousal disorder.
So there's a
Uh,
persistent sensory issue, and it can go in either direction.
yes, it's mostly you get numb, but you can have just the opposite. And this is, as it were, an akathisia of the genital area. Okay. Now, you can imagine this happening to a nun. I mean, this is the reason that the image kind of stuck for me. But this was the mid 1980s. So we knew that persistent post-treatment issues could be happening as far back as then. I was involved in a trial for SmithKline Beecham on Paxil in the early to mid 1990s. And they were going to look at the sexual effects of Paxil compared to clomipramine, which was the other drug it was being compared with. And they knew clomipramine was going to cause problems. Okay. But I mean, they drew up, the protocol for the trial, and there was going to be specially designed questionnaires to investigate the sexual aspects of all these drugs. And we, the investigators, had all these things to look through and things like that. And there was an investigators meeting in Monte Carlo, would you believe, on the Riviera,
Hmm.
Mediterranean, plush hotel, etc., etc. All the investigators were there. And we were told, look, don't complete any of the sexual questionnaires. Just don't leave them out. Okay. And we didn't really ask questions. The kind of surroundings were too nice to bother the company with saying, why not ask these questions? It later became clear to me that when I got a chance to see some of the healthy volunteer trials that SmithKline Beecham had done on this in the mid 1980s, so 10 years before this, they had found serious sexual problems in a bunch of young men. Almost all of the young men in the trial were bitterly complaining about the sexual problems on this drug after being on it for only 2 weeks. And it was clear from the trial as well that some of these problems kept going for at least a week or two afterwards. We don't know how long they kept going, but after they stopped, they monitored people
Hmm.
for a few
Hmm.
weeks afterwards.
Okay, can
And
you
these things keep
can
go
give
on.
people just I want to give people a concrete sense. Let's say someone's on an SSRI for 6 or 12 or 18 months, whatever it is, something in the normal range for how long the average person is on these things. How likely is it that someone's going to experience PSSD? How long does it last on average? And is it reversible? Is it fixable if it doesn't go away?
Yeah, first of all, let me answer the last question you've asked. It's not actually fixable.
Wow.
We've got people who have had the problem for 20 or 30 years
Wow.
after they've stopped. Um, there's a number of people uh, uh, um, uh, who can recover spontaneously, but this seems to be relatively rare. It's unclear how kind of long, how big the group who actually do recover is.
Hmm.
It's not permanent damage in that what people can find is that if they're on other drugs, and often when they stop the other drugs, they can have a window of a few days or a week or so where things do seem to improve, and they say, "Oh, great, things are better," and then they relapse again. So we've got a situation where it is permanent and in a sense isn't, if you see what I mean. It's not permanent damage, but effectively it is in the sense of we don't get things back right. But there is the hope that based on this, that there's something there that can be put right if we only have research happening on it to really work out what's going on here and how do we put it right. There is no research happening on it.
So it can be permanent or very long lasting in the people who experience PSSD. So they stop their SSRIs, sexual dysfunction lasts after the drug is out of their system. And this can last a very long time, potentially even decades or forever, maybe. How many people experience PSSD? Is this the majority of people that are on SSRIs long term? Is it 50-50? Is it, a sizable minority? Can you give us a sense for that?
Yeah, I can. There's very little work on this. There is one piece of work where crowd in Spain 20 years ago or so looking at SSRIs and looking at this was before PSSD came on the radar. So, they weren't actually trying to look at PSSD per se. They looked at the issue about how many people recover normal, hang on, normal sexual function after they halt their SSRI. And the answer they came up with is, well, roughly 50%. The other 50% don't recover full, um, full, full function of the kind that they had beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that was full-blown PSSD or just you don't get all the way back to normal, um, is unclear because they
Mm-hmm.
didn't have PSSD on the radar for them. One of the complicating factors in all this, of course, is if you're on the drug for 5 or 10 years or whatever, and you've aged,
Right.
you may start thinking, well, I'm just that bit older, maybe this is the reason
That big
that
older. I've
things
been
aren't
married all these years. There's the
things
content
aren't
of
the way
that.
that they
Yeah.
were. Yeah, yeah. But let me just bring out a feeling for how actually profound this can be. I know of 20 people who've gone on to commit suicide because they've got PSSD, and I'm sure there's a lot more than that. In terms of people who have the opposite effect, the PGAD problem, and this is more female than male, women can get
Hold
so
on. You said you have people who
distressed.
cannot. You met people who cannot climax. What did you say?
You know, Um, if you look at the opposite problem, people who've got PGAD, that's persistent genital arousal disorder.
Mm-hmm.
You're having unwelcome and unpleasant orgasms the whole time. When you drive the car, the vibration of the car can trigger an orgasm. Okay. This can be the kind of thing that's terribly uncomfortable from
Social
from
standpoint.
yes, you got a lot of people going around the place with frozen bags of peas to sit on.
Wow.
And you've got a bunch of people who go along to pain clinics and opt for a clitoridectomy
Oh,
to try and
wow.
solve the problem. So these are not minor problems. These are terribly serious problems. Okay. And as I say, there is almost no research happening on either PGAD or PSSD.
Wow. So, wow. So it's a big, this can and does happen to a lot of people on SSRIs.
Well, you've got the bunch of people who stay on SSRIs, and they stay on SSRIs because they can't get off. I mean, these are drugs, once you're on them, a proportion of people will simply not be able to get off them. Some people can get off them, a very large proportion of people can't get off them. And this is one of the reasons why we don't know how common PSSD is, because
I
in
see.
order to say you've got PSSD, you have to get off the drug.
Right.
And what happens when you get off the drug is the sexual problems you've had on the drug can get worse. It's
Right.
not just that they keep going, they can get worse. But when you're on the drug, you're not going to be functioning the way you would have functioned if you weren't on these drugs.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, like, what are the main reasons that people struggle to get off of SSRIs? Is it because of things like what you just said, where some problems get worse and they say, okay, well, I might as well go back on the drug because it's not as big of a problem?
Well, it's when you go on the pills, one of the things that can happen when you go on the pills first is you can become very agitated, you can become suicidal, you can become homicidal, etc., etc. Or you can go to drugs and things can be relatively okay. And when you try to come off them some months or years later, that's when you become agitated and become suicidal. And you kind of conclude, as my doctor told me, it's a bit like insulin. I've got a lowering of serotonin. It's a bit like diabetes. I need to continue a treatment for the rest of my life. And, you know,
Wow.
what you find when you come off the drug is you become suicidal, you go back on the drug, and almost instantly the problem clears up.
I see.
So it persuades a lot of people that, yes, that view about what's wrong with me was right, and I need to remain on these things for the rest of my life.
Wow. Okay. So I always thought like the story I always heard was, SSRI, it relates to what we talked about in the beginning, the sort of the cartoon story you often hear is, SSRIs take 6 to 8 weeks before the antidepressant effects kick in because neuroplasticity has a slow time course. And in that intervening period, you might disinhibit behavior. And that's why you get a spike in SSRI induced suicide at the beginning. But you're saying you can also get a spike in suicide if they try to come off.
Yes, and yeah, this is yes, and if you change the dose,
Hmm. Which
I
is
mean,
common.
it isn't just uh, when you actually come off; it's when you're trying to come down, you may become
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
actively suicidal. It's when you go on the drugs first, you may not have a great effect, but you may not be all that bad. You may not be suicidal, and the doctor thinks, well, you're not as good as you could be. Let's double the dose. You can become suicidal there as well.
Mhm.
But let me throw a further thing into the mix here, which we've kind of skipped over. You may want to just drag it into the conversation. Um, you're asking me about how the companies can hide things, and we've talked about FDA and how easy it is to fool FDA and things like that. The other aspect to things, of course, is that most of the medical literature reporting company assays rather than trials, which appears in the New England Journal of Medicine. Actually, there's a very interesting story I can tell you about this, uh, which appears in the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA, the various books of the Bible, and they're ghostwritten. It's
Hmm.
not just that FDA don't have access to the data in the sense of the people who are in the trial. It's the articles that companies publish have been ghostwritten. And often FDA know that the company has published an article about their trial, which says the drug worked wonderfully well and has no problems. But FDA have seen the data from the trial and not just seen the data, they haven't really looked at the data. They've been told in a covering letter by the company, our drug didn't work in this trial and it caused all sorts of problems. Okay. So FDA see an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is saying just the opposite. The company's written to FDA and told them our drug didn't work in this trial. It's got an article in the New England Journal of Medicine which says our drug worked wonderfully well and is free of problems. FDA know this is a fraud, okay? But they agree. They've responded to GSK, for instance, who've written to them and said, we've done 3 trials in teenage kids, all negative. Teenagers who were depressed, all 3 trials negative, okay? But one of them has actually been published in the leading journal in child psychiatry, saying just the opposite. Okay, GSK say, this trial was negative. FDA agree. We've looked at the trial and it appears to be negative. We also agree we're not going to mention this in the label of the drug. What's going on? This doesn't make FDA look awfully good. But the FDA response is, it's not our job to police the medical literature.
Hmm.
And it's not. So companies can write fraudulent studies with leading names, professors of psychiatry from Harvard and
Right.
Yale, in the very best journals.
Right. Which
Okay,
enable them
now,
to submit the paperwork to the FDA, and they will process that paperwork.
well, FDA won't, no, 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 no. This is all about the marketing, the sales.
Yeah.
What happened in this particular case was the article about giving the outcome of the trial had been published before the data went to FDA. It
Hmm.
was only when the company had published the article and there was an increasing amount of sales of Paxil for teenagers who are depressed that they thought, we've begun to realize, FDA will probably approve this drug anyway, even if we send the data into them, and even if we tell them the trial was negative, they're
Yeah.
probably still going to license us to say you can use this drug in teenagers who are depressed. Okay. Now, I have an interesting story which ties all of this together. There was a group of people, and you probably know, actually, you've interviewed one of them, Joe Moncrief and
Yeah.
Mark kind of Horowitz and a few other people, wrote an article for as uh, uh, for a journal called they wrote an article for Social Science in Medicine, which is a good journal, and they have it's a bunch of journals these days, one of which is for mental health issues, and
Hmm.
they wrote an article on the lowered serotonin idea, and they looked at 30 different articles and books where there were claims that yes, there's a well-known lowering of serotonin in people who are depressed. And there was I think only one of the 30 articles that they looked at which said no, that there is no kind of lowering. Okay. And they said something to the effect of, we've looked beyond these articles, and actually, when you look at it closely, there isn't really any evidence that there's anything wrong in the serotonin system in people who are depressed. Okay. So the journal asked me to review the article. I did, and I said, well, this is interesting. I mean, it is absolutely right. There's nothing wrong with the serotonin system. We've known this for a long time. But the interesting thing about this, it looks like the 29 of the 30 articles, which all claim that it's well known that there's a lowering of serotonin in people who are depressed, all look like they've been ghost-written.
Hmm.
Okay, the one article which says just the opposite, I happen to know the people involved
Hmm.
and they can't afford a
Yeah.
ghostwriter.
So
Okay.
right. So naively, if you were to just look at the literature and say, okay, let's look at all of the studies that are relevant to this question, and we're going to tally the results, and we'll use a democratic vote. Say, oh, the vast majority of studies say this. There's only one study that says that. If you do things that way, you're gonna believe the one thing, even though all of this.
Well, if you're a ghostwriter and you're working for a few different companies, you're going to sign, I mean, you're going to have tropes like that. Well, let me put it like this. Let me go back to kind of basics. Back when I was talking at meetings for the pharmaceutical companies and things to that, I agreed to get involved in a meeting. Um, and shortly after, I mean, I was told it was actually going to be in London. It's going to be reasonably high-powered meeting and things like this. And I said, yep, sure, happy to get involved. And a week later, I get an email saying, we're going to try and publish the the proceedings from the meeting. So
You're on the record.
you'll you'll actually have to hang on, you'll have to actually write an article. Okay. So I
Hmm.
said, fine, perfect. Then a week later again, I get a further email saying, and here's your article.
Hmm.
And
Wow.
I said, I kind of dropped a note back saying, look, when I agreed to get involved in this meeting, I had an idea I'd be asked to do an article, and I had some ideas about the article that I'd like to write. And I've got it more or less done. I'll email it over to you when it's finished. And I did. And they looked at it and they said, oh, this is interesting. This isn't bad. I think we'll have it. Okay. But there were some important commercial messages in the other one that we emailed over to you. And we're just going to change the name of the author. It remains, well, as I used to tell the story to people, look, if I took a bunch of my articles and put them on a table, there are people who thought they knew my work and asked them to pick out the article that I didn't write. They wouldn't have picked out the ghostwritten article because
Hmm.
it was wonderfully done. It was
Yeah.
my tone of voice, it was saying the kinds of things that I say, it was
Right.
Healy references and things
These are
like that.
good ghostwriters.
Absolutely. They're PhDs, they know how to
Yeah.
do the job,
They're
okay?
probably well paid to do a good job.
Yeah. But in the end, both the article that I wrote and the other one that was written for me got published. And they only changed one word in the article that they'd written for me. They just changed the name of the author. It's a Healy article with Healy references, but they just changed the name of the author. But for them, it was actually important because there's important commercial messages in it. So
Mhm.
when I got in touch with the journal with my review of the Moncrief et al. Article, I said, look, you can kill two birds with one stone here. You can have an article which says that the serotonin theory is just crazy, and an article which points to the likely ghostwriting input into all this, which is you've got ghostwriters whose job is to include certain important commercial messages in whatever else they write. It could be wonderful otherwise,
Right.
but it'll have a
Right.
few choice nuggets because
Yeah.
industry can't claim there's any lowering of serotonin in people who are depressed. But in their adverts, they can have David Healy say there's a lowering of serotonin in people who are depressed, provided there's a footnote to a reference to a
Right. Right.
published
Right.
article.
We're not saying that.
So,
We're just showing you the literature.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Now, the interesting thing about it was Joe and her co-authors decided this was a bit too risky. They didn't want to go there. But the editor of the journal who'd sent me the article to review said, this is a really interesting point. Do you want to write a commentary, which we'll also publish with the Moncrief article? I said, sure, fine. And I wrote a comedy short commentary, less than 1,000 words. I forget. I mean, really shortish, and emailed it to them. And the editor got back in touch with me and said, well, uh, I've been told by my co-editors that we can't publish this. She refused to specify exactly why not. She just said, this just isn't the time. Now,
Hmm.
the thing about it was that I'd made the point about the serotonin field, but said it applies to all of medicine. It's going to apply to the COVID vaccine trials as well that have
Hmm.
just recently appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine,
Right.
which I know were ghostwritten. I know the ghostwriter, and I know some of the people who were injured in the trial
Hmm.
who
Who?
disappear in the published
Wow.
article.
Who was the ghostwriter?
There's a woman called Sheena Hunt
Sheena
who
Hunt.
lives in New Zealand
And
at the Pfizer trial.
what does she do? Like, why was she the ghostwriter? What's her background?
Well, most ghostwriters, as I said, are PhDs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the ghostwriting issue, let me just bring out a point here, which I think is nice. The ghostwriting issue became a big deal around 2004 when, with the trials done on antidepressants in kids, it became clear that every publication said that these drugs worked. And the data when we got hold of it, including the Prozac data in kids, was negative.
Hmm.
Okay. And it was also clear that everything was ghost written.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a big fuss about ghostwriting, and the problem has been solved by including the names of the ghostwriters in small print at the
Wow.
end of the article. But
Wow.
that's seen as the solution. I mean, people were saying the problem with ghostwriting is you're not letting, I mean, you're making the ghost a ghost. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
nobody gives them any credit of any sort.
Yeah.
So we're just going to mention the name in
We're just
small
going to
print
name
at
the
the end.
ghost and yep, now it's all out
But
there.
when, yeah, but we aren't getting to grips with the
Right.
fact that the important commercial messages are
Right.
still
They're
going to be
still there.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So,
do you have a hard stop at the hour here?
not exactly a hard stop, no, but
Okay.
at some point I'll be
Yes. I
hoarse.
just want
But
to
anyway.
ask you one more question, one more
Mm,
topic, and I'll let you kind of steer it. But this is something that people wonder about and speculate about, I think, reasonably, and that's the issue of suicides and violence and how that relates to SSRIs and maybe related drugs. One way this manifests that I've seen this in social media, for example. Obviously we have a mass shooting problem. They're happening at a higher
mm,
frequency than they used to, certainly. I remember being in fifth grade when Columbine happened, and that was like, the first
yeah.
big one. And then, they just became
Mhm,
more and more common. I hear about them, all the time now. You'll often see on social media, for example, people will post, a collage of like 20 faces, and they'll say that they're all on SSRIs or antidepressants of some
mhm,
kind, and try to make the case of, well, there could be a relationship here. And you could say, okay, well, maybe they just cherry picked examples, and this hasn't been systematically studied. What
mhm.
can you tell us at a high level about SSRIs, violence, and the potential connection to things like mass shootings? Is there a connection here? What should we know?
Yeah, there is. Let me preface this by saying, first of all, I prescribe SSRIs. I don't not. Okay, I'm not into other kinds of therapy. I'm into using drugs to help people where appropriate. The the being able to use a drug means knowing when not to use it, and it means knowing when actually to halt it when it isn't suiting a person.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe switch to nicotine or whatever. Okay, but the yeah, and in terms of people actually becoming suicidal on SSRIs, first of all, one of the difficult things for companies and anyone to explain is the healthy volunteers who've actually gone on to commit suicide on these drugs in very brief trials. Uh, People who are normal, deeply Christian, totally against the idea that that I might kill myself, who kill themselves on these drugs
Hmm.
and kill themselves
Hmm.
withdrawing from the
So it's
drugs.
not just people who are already on the brink or who had attempted suicide
No,
before.
no,
Yeah.
no. People who are going to college need a bit of money to help pay the fees or whatever, pretty healthy people. Yeah. So, in terms of people who have gone on to commit suicide or gone on to commit homicide, I'm actually the best person that a pharmaceutical company could use in terms of defending themselves, in the sense that if I interview a person who's been on a drug and has gone on to commit homicide or whatever, uh, believing that the drugs can cause this, if I say no, the drug hasn't caused it in this case, I'm going to be more credible than an expert who says, oh, no, these drugs can't cause a problem. Because juries faced with cases like this have said, well, we're not going to believe the experts, we're not going to believe the company, we're not going to believe the published articles. It's very, very clear. I mean, juries of lay people have actually concluded it's very, very clear that the drugs can cause a problem.
Mhm.
Judges and prosecutors have quietly agreed with the uh, defense that yes, the only way to explain this man killing his wife was the influence of the drug he was on. Okay. Now, in terms of all of the mass homicides and things like that, where people have claimed the drugs have been involved, um, we have a big problem, which is the person who's shot everyone is usually dead as well. The one
Mm.
case where this hasn't happened has been James Holmes, the Batman Rises, the
In the movie theater
Dark
shooting.
Knight Rises, the Aurora, Colorado
Yeah.
shooting.
Yeah.
Holmes was a quiet, shy university student who was put on an SSRI by the I forget the name of the university he was in, but by one of the doctors in the university, he becomes disinhibited and much less shy and begins to keep a diary and gives a great description of the effects of SSRIs on him. He's becoming manic and disinhibited, and he buys a motorbike, he buys guns, he goes to a shooting range and starts shooting.
Hmm.
Never had done any
Hmm.
of this before.
Basically, his whole
Uh,
personality changes.
yeah, yeah. And he starts thinking and talking about plans to shoot a bunch of people. He goes on to his doctor, who increases the dose of the pills, who he says to her, look, if you knew the thoughts going through my mind, you'd lock me up. And she looks at him and says, well, you're responsible for what you do. She doesn't think the drug could be causing the problem.
Right.
Okay. So Holmes goes into the movie theater and shoots
Hmm.
dead 12
Hmm.
people and shoots and injures
Hmm.
72 others.
And
Okay.
was he disgruntled about something, or is this just sort of like
No,
spontaneously he just has the notion in his mind that he's going to commit violence for no apparent reason?
no, there's a little trend in his thinking. He's a very introverted, shy kind of character who is slightly misanthropic. He's
I
not
see.
enthusiastic about other people. Okay.
So
But
maybe
it's
he wasn't
all
having social
terribly,
success, and he developed
yeah,
a misanthropic viewpoint.
well, not gross misanthropy. It was just, the kind of thing where, I mean, some people love other people, others just are, wary about other people
Yeah,
and
yeah.
not usually enthusiastic about them. There was nothing particularly pathological here. Um, but anyway, there's a few interesting angles to this. The defense team got in touch with me and said, look, we'd like you to come and look at the case. And from what they were saying, I wasn't hugely convinced that there was anything here to look at. It was only when I ended up in jail talking to him that I became convinced that, yes, absolutely, this drug had caused him to do what he did. He'd he was off the drug this time. He had been in jail for a while. At some point while he was in jail, they put him back on an SSRI and he became suicidal and tried to kill himself in jail.
Hmm.
I ended up interviewing both his parents afterwards who didn't know he was on an SSRI and might have had anything to do with his case. After all of this had happened, both of his parents, at one point or another got treated with an SSRI by their doctor, and both had reactions like his. They had
Really?
not that they wanted to kill people, but they had clear
Personality
behavioral
shifts.
reactions to the SSRIs that were consistent with the kinds of things that happened to him. Okay.
Wow.
So in the case, my hunch is that the public defender he had, they're not particularly in the business of winning a high profile case. They just want to make sure he isn't executed. He was in a state where you could have been executed for all
Yeah.
this. So it's going to be a win for them if they could just get this past the jury so that he got jailed for something like 300,000 years or whatever it is,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
actually executed. Okay. Um, and in the end, they didn't use my testimony or the report that I'd done on them saying, look, this man was not guilty. Okay. Part of the problem here is that, you've got to try and persuade a jury to let a man who has killed 12 other people and seriously injured 72 others walk out of jail, walk out of the court a free man. You know, that's not something a jury are going to be able to do in a hurry. You've got to persuade the jury that FDA knew these drugs could do it. You've got to persuade a jury that Pfizer knew that this drug, Zoloft, could do it because they'd given it to healthy volunteers 10 years before the drug came on the market for people who were depressed and shown the same things happening in healthy volunteers and written at the bottom, our drug can cause this. So, and you've got all these articles in the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA, which say this drug works wonderfully well and is free of problems. Can you persuade a jury to tear up their view of the universe,
Right.
everything that they've trusted up to this, to destroy the Bible? You're not going to be able to do that in a hurry, particularly if you're a public defender.
Right.
So my hunch is that they came to an agreement with the legal team for Pfizer on the other side that
Huh.
we would ensure this guy doesn't get executed.
Wow.
So I can tell you about that. I mean, with all the other guys who are dead, we really can't know for sure. You may know that they're on a drug, you may know that they're on a drug that can
Yeah.
cause this kind of
But,
thing.
but okay,
But
but we
unless you
have
get to interview the person,
yeah.
I don't,
We've got
you
this
know.
one case where the shooter survives. You personally were involved and you sort of saw the whole thing from the inside out. And that's what you just told us. We've got all these other cases where we can't do that because the shooter was killed. But, if we start to think more generally about how common things like suicide and suicidal ideation are with SSRIs, can you give us just sort of the basic lay of the land there? Is this a very common side effect?
Yeah, in the healthy volunteer trial that we did, or that I did, 1 in 10 of the volunteers became suicidal on an SSRI.
I mean, that's a big effect. 1 in 10 become suicidal. And
Yep.
these are otherwise
Now,
healthy people.
yes. Now, a lot of people, when this happens, have the wit to stop. And the curious
Right.
thing about it all is that you've got some antihistamines which are available over the counter, which are potent SSRIs and can cause you to become agitated and have withdrawal effects and all the problems SSRIs can cause,
Really?
but are
Like over the
safer to
counter
take.
antihistamines?
Yes,
Like
totally.
what? Like Zyrtec?
Chlorpheniramine, for instance. I'm not
Okay.
sure what the trade name in the United States. Diphenhydramine, Benadryl.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, what happens when it's over the counter? If you go and get this over the counter, I mean, you're not getting it as an SSRI or as an antidepressant, but if you get this drug and take it and it doesn't suit you, what do? You stop it. You're
Right.
not inhibited by your doctor who keeps saying, oh no, you need to keep
Yeah.
taking it
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
6 weeks before we stop it.
Right.
So part of the problem isn't just the drug, it's the fact that you can only get it through your doctor. And he's been educated by the New England Journal of Medicine, ghostwritten fraudulent articles to think that there are no problems with these things. And if you're complaining, you're just an anecdote, and this is all in your mind. In fact, you're more seriously than we thought you were. So,
Well, I mean, I want to thank you for your time because we've already talked a little bit longer than our schedule, but this is obviously a big topic. This touches a lot of people because these things are prescribed to so many people that, if you're not on one or have been on one yourself, you certainly know people who have been. Any final thoughts or major takeaways you want to leave people with about this general subject of SSRIs and the whole enterprise of psychiatric medicine today?
yeah, first of all, it's there are a lot of people who can be helped by SSRIs, and as I've indicated, I don't not prescribe them. Um, the issue isn't so much the pills per se, it's the way doctors have been manipulated and educated into using these pills, which is the harmful thing. Our medical journals have failed us. It's not so much the pills that are failing us. It's much more a case of the medical system, the doctors, our journals, and things like that. The professionalism that just isn't there. The willingness to stand up on behalf of the people that we're treating, the people that we're making money out of, we're not doing it. We're not showing backbone. So the issue, it's a mistake. You're not going to solve the problem by just trying to get rid of pills. You've got to call on doctors to really
Mm-hmm.
step up to the plate.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the SSRI group of drugs, it's all drugs. It's the
Mm-hmm.
statins, it's antibiotics, it's
Yeah.
every drug we use is, well, almost all the drugs we use are actually um, um, uh, affected in much the same ways. It's the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
ghostwriting is the same hiding of the data
Mhm.
and a bunch of problems that you're told, well, no,
Mhm.
this is all in your mind.
Is it for those of us that look at the literature directly or indirectly, we're reading clinical trials or reading about clinical trials? In your view, in terms of ghostwriting, industry bias, and things like that, when we read papers about these drug trials, should we assume they're innocent until proven guilty or guilty until proven innocent?
Yeah, I think you've got to recognize that, first of all, companies aren't doing trials to inform clinical practice. That's the first thing. Secondly, they are going to have massaged the article and the data. And just because it appears in a really good journal, you can't uh, necessarily credit the fact that it is going to be honest. And these things, the better the journal it's in, the more useful for industry in terms of being able to market the drug.
Mhm.
Because it's in a good journal, it gets built into the standards of care,
Right,
which shape what doctors do. And they figure if they aren't keeping to the standards of care, they're at legal risk themselves. So, of
right,
course, they're not going to keep the standards of care. If they agree with you that the drug's causing a problem, they're going to lose their job if they agree with you. It's much easier. It's better for the organization they work in. It's more legally defensible to stick with what the standard of care says. So, yeah, so it's a tricky situation we've got, and it's one that badly needs reform. Whether we're going to get the reform or not, I'm not sure.
well, David, thank you very much for your time. This was fascinating and obviously disturbing in many ways, but this is important information for people, and I really, really appreciate it.
Okay, it was good to chat next. Thanks.
If you like to read like I do, then you should check out the ReadWise app. It's totally free to download, and if you go through the link in the episode description or on my support page, you can get a free 60-day trial for zero cost. ReadWise is a really cool app that allows you to import digital highlights from over 30 different platforms such as Kindle, iBooks, PDFs, and more. It makes it really easy for you to review and find and share excerpts and quotes from whatever it is that you're reading, whether it's PDFs of scientific papers or books that you're reading on your Kindle, and you can even save and use highlights from physical books. I read a lot of physical books before bed, for example, or when I'm traveling, and the ReadWise app actually integrates with the camera on your phone so that you can take a photo of a page that you're reading, highlight a specific chunk of text from that page, and export it to the app so that you can reference it or find it or share it later. They even allow you to export really cool looking graphics of some of the highlights that you have in the books or the papers you're reading so that you can share them in an engaging way. So check out the ReadWise app today if you are a reader and you like to reference and organize what you read. Go through the link in the episode description or on my support page or in my free weekly newsletter at mindandmatter.substack.com and try the ReadWise app 60 days free today.